Hello and welcome back to my humble show. So I'm not sure exactly how I want to break this down, but I've been meaning to talk about this since just before the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And because I believe this is what he would be talking about if he were still alive, I think it's worth talking about. Also, it's in regards to someone else who died, someone else who was slaughtered in public on video. Iryna Zarutska, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing her name, Ukrainian refugee who was, like I said, slaughtered in North Carolina. Yes, by a black man. And not to racialize this, like Van Jones and CNN would have you believe that Charlie Kirk did, but truth be told, mainstream media didn't want to touch this story, and we know exactly why. A couple of weeks went by, 0 articles, 0 news segments. People on the right, like Charlie Kirk, were calling it out for what it was. And then liberal media, such as CNN, finally began to cover it, mostly just to try to dunk on the likes of Charlie Kirk. So they did that the day before his death, his assassination. There was this segment on CNN, Abby Phillips' panel, which included Van Jones. And they put forth one of the most pathetic segments I've ever seen on CNN, and that's saying something. So I want to break that down. At first, because Charlie Kirk was in the news being blasted essentially as a racist just hours before his assassination. Initially, I thought maybe those things were tied together, but it turns out Tyler Robinson, his assassin, had been planning for a week or so, according to him, in his messages to his lover. Yeah. But I'm not going to talk about the assassination so much. I'm going to be talking about what led up to it, though it wasn't necessarily connected to it. Like I said, I was going to talk about this the day Charlie Kirk was assassinated. I had been so bothered by CNN's coverage of Charlie Kirk's coverage of the Iryna Zarutska murder that I put my first video up on my Articulate Thinker News Clips channel in several months. Since my wife and I had our first child and all, I hadn't been able to find the time and energy and motivation, in all honesty, to upload much content anywhere on my News Clips channel or this one. So yes, I had uploaded a compilation of clips about CNN's smears against Charlie Kirk. And then I put together a thread on my X account, was going to cover it the next day on this channel, this podcast channel. And then I woke up that morning and found out that Charlie Kirk had been murdered. So, yeah, I put that on pause for a little while, but, the media didn't want to touch it at all. Then the news cycle changed because of what happened over the past week, so on and so forth. But I want to talk about this not just as a headline, but as a bigger societal conversation. So let me start with this segment from CNN where they're smearing Charlie Kirk for his coverage of that which they had previously refused to cover until they had their Republicans pounce moment. So they thought. All right. Here we go.
Unfortunately, we don't have services that they used to have for mentally ill people in terms of dealing with them. And I think the problem here is, I'm guessing the Trump administration was looking for an example. This video was quite disturbing. You have the combination of social media at the same time blowing it up, and so it creates sort of the perfect storm to point to something. Just like when Dukakis, when he was running for president, Lee Atwater took advantage of that one incident that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there are many more incidents which you could point to if you wanted to. But you're looking specifically for any anecdote which fits your particular narrative. Ironic how everything they're saying there about the right, about the Trump administration even, applies directly to themselves, because they say the Trump administration was looking for something to talk about, something that fit their narrative. Okay, what is it CNN does? Day after day, after month after month, after year, they cover what fits their narrative in the way which fits their narrative. So it's very ironic and lacking of self-awareness for her to say what she's saying right now.
That was terrible. That was very troubling for voters once they called attention to it.
So certain people have been looking for an opportunity to find a case like this, to make a point like this. I want to play, this is Charlie Kirk, why he says this hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
A white Ukrainian refugee was murdered just because she was white. Everybody knows that, obviously. If a random white person simply walked up to and stabbed a nice, law-abiding black person for no reason, it would be an apocalyptically huge national story used to impose national sweeping political changes on the whole country. Instead, Megan Basham, no one seems to care when a white woman gets stabbed to the death.
Wow. He said white a lot.
Wow, he said white a lot? That's the response? They're not even really going to deny his claim about how if it were the other way around, it would be national news for weeks on end. What's our example? Look no further than George Floyd and so many other cases which have been on the news since, especially during that time frame, that 2020-2021 time frame. Every time there was violence, whether justified or not, whether it involved police or not, against someone who is black, racial tension through the roof, riots in the streets, Wendy's getting burned down, and that's not even the half of it. But, you know, when it's the other way around, a white woman who happens to be a Ukrainian refugee, which you would think would fit the narrative of so many in the media, especially those political pundits who previously had Ukrainian flags in their bios. They had nothing to say about it. No news coverage. Nothing. Zilch. Nada. Until people on the right, conservatives like Charlie Kirk, spoke up and said, hey, I'm seeing a bit of a trend here.
We are talking about it here on ABC, so I guess I mean, I don't think that's fair. Look, being in the system, because I have represented people who are mentally ill, and here's the balance. The balance is taking away people's freedom versus evaluating their mental illness. And New York City, there are a lot of programs for people who are mentally ill, but they have to want to be there.
Yeah,
So now it's all about mental illness, as it is every time they want it to be. This guy who murdered her had been arrested 14 times. Slaps on the wrist, I'd say. Then he's out and about, ready to kill. That's exactly what he did. He killed for the thrill.
It's about forcing them to be there.
When you are mentally ill, you have a hard time knowing that you are mentally ill. But also, I mean, people like Charlie Kirk, they've been looking for opportunities to make this some sort of like reciprocal George Floyd situation.
Reciprocal George Floyd situation. So, this is one of those earmark moments. But she gets it exactly backwards. She says this is nothing like George Floyd, when in reality, it's everything that they claimed George Floyd was and more, aside from the law enforcement element. I get that. But on the one hand, you had George Floyd, who was in the middle of committing a crime, was detained by police, resisted arrest for an extensive amount of time. He actually said, I can't breathe, before they ever even put him on the ground. He was on the ground because he demanded to be on the ground rather than in the car, which they were trying to put him in. These are things that you were not told by people like the ones on the screen right now at that time. And George Floyd refused, absolutely refused to comply. there are 4 officers. 3 were not Derek Chauvin. And they were not all white at all. And yet the whole thing was covered through a racial lens. There was never a mention of skin color by any of those officers. Nothing that was ever recorded. And yes, it was recorded. It was something that was recorded and then used to fit a narrative, just like Kara Switcher and all of these other people on this panel are claiming the Trump administration has done. They saw a video go viral and they thought, this is our opportunity. Because they're opportunists of the highest order or the lowest order. But yes, George Floyd case had so little, as in nothing, to do with race, that race wasn't even an element in the actual trial itself. But you can't tell me that the trial was not compromised, that the jury was not compromised after all the rioting and, like I said, racial tensions which took place. There was a supposed racial reckoning all across the country. Justice for George Floyd. Say his name. I can't breathe. So on and so forth. Marching in the streets. Black Lives Matter. Antifa. It was never ending, and the pressure was at an extreme. So Derek Chauvin was found guilty. He went to prison, and feel about that how you may, but, you know, I'd still say that does not exactly make George Floyd the martyr that he was treated as. Worthy of statues, worthy of this, worthy of that. You know, Saint George Floyd. It was sad. What happened was sad. But these talking heads on television, they gave him royal treatment. They did. But now they say this is nothing like that, when in fact this is everything that was according to them and more. Because in this case, the races are reversed and you have a black man for no reason stabbing a white woman to death. And then saying, I got that white woman. I got that white woman. Of course, they don't talk about that. Instead, they talk about how no one was talking about race except for Charlie Kirk.
And that's the part that I think he's almost giving away the game, and it's sad to see a lot of people going along with it.
You know, let me just say a couple of things. One is, I mean, what happened to that young woman was horrible. And it's everybody's nightmare. If you're in any public space, subway, whatever, that something bad's going to happen to you or somebody you care about. So it does strike a chord. We don't know why that man did what he did.
We don't know why that man did what he did. Is that what you said about Derek Chauvin? No.
And for Charlie Kirk to say, we know he did it because she's white, when there's no evidence of that.
Really? Aside from the evidence? So, when a black man kills a white woman and says, I got that white woman, there's no evidence of any motive at all. You don't know why it happened. But when a white police officer kills a black man who's resisting arrest, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there's no mention of race, and yet you know exactly why it happened. You know the motive. You know everything about it. Weird how that works, right?
It's just pure race mongering, hate mongering. It's wrong. Then he says that if something like that had happened the other way, there would be sweeping changes imposed on society. Where is the George Floyd Policing Act?
Oh. So you're just proving Charlie Kirk's point. Sure. Policing Act may have failed because not everyone went along with it, but there was literally an attempt to change the law across the country because of what happened to George Floyd. So that's a sweeping change, or an attempt at a sweeping change, is it not? So thank you for making his point while acting as though you're disproving it.
It didn't pass. Even when you had a white police officer murder a black man on live television, the whole world saw, there were no sweeping changes. In fact, not one law was passed at the federal level. So
It's also interesting how, and I know I'm making the comparison to George Floyd, but several years later, someone gets murdered, cold-blooded murdered, and they're like, how can we make this about how George Floyd was really the victim instead of her? They're really not spending a lot of time focusing on the actual victim in this case, are they?
So I think that's an important thing to point out. The other thing is, you mentioned the thing about cashless bail. I think this is a big challenge that we have. Would you have felt better if there had been cash bail and the mom had come and put down $1,000 to let him out? It's not about cashless bail or no cashless bail. It's about the fact that we don't know how to deal with people who are hurting in the way this man was hurting. Hurt people hurt people. What happened was horrible, but it becomes an opportunity for people to jump on bandwagons. And then for someone like Charlie Kirk, he should be ashamed of himself. No one mentioned the word race, white, black, or anything except him.
Really? No one? Except for DeCarlos himself.
People mention is the horror of what happened to this young woman.
Wow. So I'll play the end of that again.
$1,000 to let him out. It's not about cashless bail or no cashless bail. It's about the fact that we don't know how to deal with people who are hurting in the way this man was hurting.
It's about how the murderer was hurting.
Hurt people hurt people.
Hurt people hurt people. Is that what you said when Derek Chauvin took the life directly or indirectly of George Floyd? And I keep emphasizing my uncertainty about that because George Floyd was on drugs. A lot of drugs. Enough drugs to kill a man. That's what all the experts testified to. They had pronounced people dead because of overdose who had less drugs in their system than that. So there was that. He also didn't have the greatest health. He also had a history of violence and violent crimes himself. Not quite 14 arrests, I don't believe, but he had, for example, taken part in an armed robbery where he held a gun on a woman so her home could be robbed. That was George Floyd. Not saying he was that way at the time of his death, but that's who these people favored. That's who everyone was putting black squares on their social media accounts for.
What happened was horrible, but it becomes an opportunity for people to jump on bandwagons. And then for someone like Charlie Kirk, he should be ashamed of himself. No one mentioned the word race, white, black, or anything except him. What people mention is
Really?
the horror of what happened to this young woman.
Lies. Lies or ignorance. I'm not sure exactly. It could be both. Maybe Van Jones was ignorant, didn't know the details of the crime which had been committed, so he's just assuming. In which case he's making stuff up, which is essentially a lie. This is one of the most pathetic segments I've ever seen from CNN, and that's saying a lot. Literally everything they accuse the right of doing is what they themselves do endlessly. This cold-blooded murder of Iryna Zarutska was everything they claimed George Floyd's death was, yet they reluctantly covered it. Or they're reluctantly covering it. That's what I said at the time, but time has passed since then, so. But they, yes, reluctantly covered it, making excuses for it, and even arguing that it's not clearly heinous as what happened to George Floyd, despite it clearly being even more heinous. A cold-blooded murder with no qualifiers at all. The Republicans' pounce gaslighting has reached a new level. Scott Jennings is off the panel for 5 minutes and all insanity breaks loose. Yeah, he would have at least attempted to set them straight on there. But here's Charlie Kirk on with Will Cain responding to Van Jones, accusing him of making the murder of Iryna Zarutska about race, despite the fact that there's footage of DeCarlos Brown saying, "I got that white girl," immediately after stabbing her to death. Which, by the way, I could go ahead and play. It's hard to hear, but read the caption. I got that white girl. I might have said white woman, but he said I got that white girl. Weird how that works. call him a black boy, that's very racially offensive. He's talking about getting that white girl. That's, I guess, not even newsworthy. Who in mainstream media even covered this part of the video? And of course, the news cycle has changed, as I previously mentioned, but still, they had plenty of time to talk about it and refused. So yes, DeCarlos Brown Jr., I got that white girl. Van Jones, with the approval of his CNN colleagues. We don't know why that man did what he did. Listen, I'm not saying that the entirety of the motive was racially driven, but if this is the murder which Van Jones is suddenly going to shrug off as hurt people hurting people, it's because he has the intellectual capacity of a race hustler. And I'm not going to say that he's a horrible person, although he seemed to believe that Charlie Kirk was a horrible person. I just think he's incompetent. He has the sort of implicit bias which he would accuse people like me of having. But yes, Charlie Kirk on with Will Kane responding to Van Jones, accusing him of making the murder of Iryna Zarutska about race, despite the fact that there's footage of DeCarlos Brown saying, I got that white girl, immediately after stabbing her to death. If it was a white guy named Daniel Penny fatally restraining a black guy who was threatening people on the subway, these liberal media talking heads would be ranting and raving and rambling about race until, oh wait, that happened. Yeah, remember? Daniel Penny restrained a black man who was threatening to kill people on a subway, accidentally killed him, and everyone in the media was led to believe, obviously, that he was a racist white guy, because it's supposedly a given if you're white, but not the other way around, even if... Anyways, getting a little worked up here. In this clear case of cold-blooded black-on-white murder, they wait days to even mention it. After they get lambasted all over social media, then they reluctantly cover it, only to make excuses for it and find ways to argue that the real tragedy is how conservatives are using it, in the exact way that they use any death which fits their narrative. This is a 4+ minute long clip. I'm going to just play it through. Charlie Kirk can speak for himself. Could.
Now, joining me now to respond is Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk. Charlie, it's great to see you. You heard Van Jones. He called you a race monger, said you're the only one that brought up race. What do you say to Van Jones?
Well, first of all, as you aptly noted, that in the video, it's pretty clear that the attacker said, quote, that white girl. Secondly, Van Jones, he puts race in almost every situation where it doesn't exist.
True. Van Jones puts race in almost every situation where it doesn't exist. Sorry, I'm speeding this up. I sped up the clip, so that's why he's talking fast all of a sudden.
For example, with the death of George Floyd, Van Jones repeatedly said that was a racist attack. You know who didn't say that? Keith Ellison, who was the Attorney General of Minnesota at the time, said that race did not play any role in the actions that happened with George Floyd's death. But even beyond that, and I think this is what's very important, is that we are living in a mental model and a framing post-2020. The 2020 model is that the worst thing that could possibly happen is racial attacks. Remember, even before that, Jussie Smollett or the FBI being mobilized for even the slightest whisper of a hate crime. But now, all of a sudden, when we make the left live up to their own standard of rules, there is complete silence by the entire American media. And then Van Jones goes on television and calls me a race hustler for even calling out the facts and the specifics around this case. Now, this is what's quite interesting, because why is it the media was so quiet on this? You got to wonder, Will, because if the roles were reversed, and I tweeted this out and I will stand by it, if a white attacker was minding his own business and a perfectly law-abiding black individual was minding her own business, and that white attacker took out a knife and was relentlessly hacking a law-abiding black girl, you and I both know, Will, this would be national headlines, and there'd be more than 0 headlines, as you pointed out on your show yesterday. And so Van Jones, he wants to keep on trying to find racial motives that don't exist, and he ignores them when they're in broad daylight in front of him on recorded video and a horrendous attack such as this. The media...
True. All of that true. Yeah, when it was Jussie Smollett, all of his friends, politicians, people in positions of power, people in the media, pundits, all the talking heads were on his side immediately. Modern day lynching this, modern day lynching that. Hate crime of the century turned out to be a hate hoax and a race hoax. Jussie Smollett, pathological liar, made up everything, and everyone believed him, at least everyone on the left did. and they never made apologies for their cultish mentality, then what's another example? Bubba Wallace, the supposed noose in the garage, which turned out to be a garage door pulley after an extensive FBI investigation, right? All the empathy was with him at the time, even though it was not deserved at all. Not saying he was responsible for that, but he kind of played into it.
Doesn't care about this, and we should start asking why.
What is the answer to that, Charlie? Why?
I mean, it doesn't fit a narrative. This is my most charitable reading. The narrative that they have pushed forward in the last 10 years is that there is a relentless assault against black people on behalf of white people. And the data does not show that. You brilliantly pointed this out on your program yesterday. In fact, it's the exact opposite. White individuals are actually more likely to be attacked, especially even per capita, by black individuals in this country. The narrative that they have tried to force feed this nation post-2020 is that we are a systemically racist country to our core. We started to say the word racist more. We started to redesign our corporations. We started to teach things in our classrooms that were from the 1619 Project. And all of this has now been met with an appropriate backlash where people said, we're actually not nearly as racist as you say we are. In fact, we're the least racist country ever to exist in the history of the world. And in fact, if you want to actually talk about race-focused activity, why is it that you then ignore all the race-focused activity of black on white crime? Well, I want to live in a race-neutral country. I don't like talking about race all the time. But when I see it, and I see the left ignore it, and we try to make them live up to their own standard of rules that they force-fed us during the chaos of 2020, it really goes to show the destruction that this can lead to the entire nation. The final thing I'll say is this, Will, is that this is more than just a semantic argument. This is more than just whether or not it's a race thing or not. Bad policing practices, consent decrees,
yes,
opening up the prisons. As you say, $3.3 million is an outgrowth of a media narrative lie. So it's not just an innocent media narrative lie. Real policies get put into place when you don't challenge this nonsense in the public square.
That's it. That's very, very well said, Charlie. Race is a part of the story, not just because of the media's lies of omission. Race is a part of the story, not just because of the potential words from the suspect on the light rail in Charlotte. Race is a part of the story because of the policies implemented by a racial lie post-2020. Exactly. And that's what we need to remember today. These are a consequence of a lie that created policies. Charlie Kirk, well said. As always, thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here.
When the worth of a story is determined by a race, there's a lot of questions to ask about the current state of mainstream media. That's what Charlie Kirk was doing. He was asking questions. That's what I'm doing. I'm asking questions. Not really asking questions, more so making statements, because we know why the coverage is not consistent. And obviously there's racism in this country which cuts both ways. Not just one way, both ways. It's just that a lot more cuts a certain way than they would have you believe, and a lot of it is perpetuated by them being the people, starting with the people in the panel at the beginning of this show, people on CNN, who just cannot help themselves. When it's one way, it's assumed that the motive is racial. When it's the other way, it's assumed that hurt people just hurt people. This is why DeCarlos Brown Jr. killed Iryna Zarutska in a nutshell. Because he's a violent maniac who felt comfortable enough in his own skin, both figuratively and literally speaking, to continue perpetuating the personal cycle of violence he was living in. As a side note, it's interesting how if someone like Daniel Penny had prevented him from carrying out his act of violence, the left would say something like, just because he was suffering from mental illness doesn't mean he was really going to become violent. But since he did become violent, they'll instead suggest that it was because he was dealing with mental illness. Isn't that interesting? Just depends on the details. They'll deny that it had anything to do with mental illness or claim that it had everything to do with mental illness. In some cases, they say, you can't just assume that because mental illness is involved, they're going to become violent, but then when they do become violent, it's because of mental illness. Or if a gun is involved, it's because of guns. Now, Democrats don't want to ban knives, so they didn't make this particular murder about knives. But if a gun was involved, it would be about guns. Look at that. That is an amount of fear which no woman or man should ever feel. And yeah. this here on the screen. All the mugshots. DeCarlos Brown Jr. What's also crazy is that there are people in positions of power with opportunities to run cities like Zoran Mondani who apparently believe that more violent people like this belong on the streets. Wants to cut the prison population significantly, and not exactly by preventing crimes, I don't imagine, because someone with a worldview like his is not really capable of preventing crimes, at least not reducing them. When something like this happens, the left keeps arguing that crime is actually going down. Until a crime or murder fits their narrative, then they're back to shouting, "This is Trump's America." So yeah, I've heard a lot lately with Donald Trump's attempts to send National Guard troops into different cities. Crime is actually going down, so this is just an abuse of power. Of course, the people who want to take guns away are saying that, ironically. But then, if and when a crime happens which fits their narrative, they say, "This is Trump's America. Violence everywhere. Blood in the streets." So I don't want to hear about how the Trump administration jumped on this story when MSM ignored it until they could jump on Republicans for jumping on it. I have some other stuff in this thread here. I am running over time, over 30 minutes now. I wanted to keep this short, but it's just not that simple. So a statement from the mayor of Charlotte on the killing of Iryna Zarutska. So she condemned it, but she also said, "I want to thank our media partners and community members who have chosen not to repost or share the footage out of respect for Iryna's family." Yeah, heaven forbid there be widespread imagery of a black man murdering a white woman. I say that because I'm pretty sure if it were the other way around, you would not be encouraging people not to share the footage. I saw people like Harry Sisson on X saying the same thing, saying that it was absurd that anyone was sharing the footage of Charlie Kirk getting assassinated around. And while I myself was not sharing that footage because it's just so graphic, I know that if it was something that fit Harry Sisson's narrative, he would be sharing it himself. Go back a matter of months, Harry Sisson was calling Charlie Kirk a Nazi KKK member, saying, "Just put the hood on." And then he pretends to have genuine thoughts and feelings about Charlie Kirk's death. Whatever, man. Right, isn't that interesting how if some violent video fits someone's narrative, they share it themselves. But then if it doesn't, they scold other people for sharing it, saying that it's insensitive to share it. I've just found that to be the case in so many cases. Yeah, so I asked, question, is Mayor V. Lyles unintentionally suggesting that it was disrespectful when the left endlessly shared images of George Floyd's death, for example? Or are these things selective? I think they are. So I said, also an example of North Carolina's focus on racial equity in criminal justice, which in part led to the multiple releases, slap on the wrist releases of the aforementioned DeCarlos Brown Jr. So as Megan Basham said, instead of keeping your constituents safe, this has been your priority. And now we see the results. Homicide rate that jumped 40% last year. Oh, but I thought crime was decreasing. Not everywhere. Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. The word equity does not belong in the same sentence as justice. Equality, sure. Equity, no thanks. to be fair to the mayor, she published the statement as well. Make of it what you will. I'm not going to read all of that because that's not really what this is about. Not to knock her too much. More so, I'm knocking the lack of due diligence by mainstream media as seen in this image on the left here. This was the truth. For quite an amount of time, zero coverage on Iryna Zarutska. And as End Wokeness, X account End Wokeness pointed out at the time, zero AP stories on this deadly attack, zero PBS stories on this deadly attack, zero New York Times stories on this deadly attack, zero NPR stories on this deadly attack, zero Wall Street Journal stories on this deadly attack, zero BBC stories on this deadly attack, zero CNN stories on this deadly attack, zero Washington Post stories on this deadly attack, zero Reuters stories on this deadly attack, and zero MSNBC stories on this deadly attack. And you could go into the archives of these different news networks online and search her name, and you would get no articles. And this went on for days. Days. Despite there being, like, video. George Floyd level video. Worse than George Floyd, if you ask me, because of the other factors I already factored in. He just murdered a stranger because he felt like it, and she was a Ukrainian refugee, and you would think that would fit the narrative more than it turned out that it did. But no coverage until they were lambasted. So rest in peace to her. This was the Justice Department getting involved, in case you missed the federal charge. I could pull that up. And I don't know if you can see the words on the screen. I don't know if I want to read through all of this either. But if you want the link to it, let me know in the comments below. You can read it for yourself. Liberal, leftist media, whatever you want to call them, they waited for the Trump administration to get involved. They waited for Charlie Kirk to speak his mind, and then they finally began to cover it. Only to cover it inaccurately and attempt to smear Charlie Kirk. To complete this thread, here's what President Trump said about the murder of Iryna Zarutska. Make of it what you will as well. Rest in peace, as I said. But Trump said, I have seen the horrific video of a beautiful young Ukrainian refugee who came to America to escape the vicious war in Ukraine and was innocently riding the metro in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she was brutally ambushed by a mentally deranged lunatic who, according to Van Jones, was just a hurt person hurting people. The perpetrator was a well-known career criminal who had been previously arrested and released on cashless bail in January, a total of 14 times. What the HE double hockey sticks was he doing riding the train and walking the streets? Criminals like this need to be locked up. The blood of this innocent woman can literally be seen dripping from the killer's knife, and now her blood is on the hands of the Democrats who refuse to put bad people in jail, including former disgraced governor and wannabe Senator Roy Cooper. North Carolina and every state needs law and order, and only Republicans will deliver it. Additionally, where is the outrage from the mainstream media on this horrible tragedy? And then he says, vote for so-and-so. Not going to make it about that. Not exactly the best time for campaigning, but he's saying, if you don't want this to continue happening, make a change. So, in summary, I put together this video. This is the video I uploaded to my Articulate Thinker News Clips channel just hours before Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and the rest is his story. But thought that was worth talking about even now. Let it not be forgotten. A lot of things happen in this country. Horrible things to innocent people in some cases. All worth talking about, but certain things really highlight the low light that is mainstream media coverage these days, and the selectivity, the implicit bias, the reverse racism even. And I say, reverse racism is still racism. It doesn't actually reverse racism. But that's it for me. I've got to go for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Be happy to hear from you, even if you disagree with me. Peace.